Everyone in Millbrook thought Clara Bennett had finally lost her mind. When the 17-year-old girl began dragging garbage bags full of what looked like dried, dead roots onto the most worthless acre in Mason County, the town laughed. Her own family slammed the door on her, and even the old farmers at the co-op shook their heads and told her to stop before she wasted her last dollar on dirt that wouldn't even grow thistles. But Clara wasn't acting on a whim. For 3 years, she had quietly watched her grandmother work with these same twisted, woody roots, noticing something about them that nobody else paid attention to. She had seen the way her grandmother's hands moved when she handled the rough, brown tubers that everyone else called garbage. She had memorized the sound of her grandmother's voice when she spoke about the secret they held beneath their dead-looking skin. And now, with her grandmother gone and her family determined to erase every trace of the old woman's life, Clara was going to prove that what looked dead was only waiting. The acre sat behind the old Henderson barn, a patch of ground so compacted and gray that the county had written it off as unbuildable 20 years ago. The clay was thick enough to crack in summer and slick enough to drown in winter. Nothing had grown there since the dairy operation closed, except for patches of crabgrass and the occasional lonely dandelion. Clara found it by accident, walking the back roads with 2 garbage bags of roots slung over her shoulders like a soldier carrying ammunition. The property owner, a retired mechanic named Earl, who lived 3 miles down the road, had laughed when she asked about renting it. He told her she could have it for the price of clearing the rusted fence line, and he made her promise she wouldn't sue him when she finally realized what a joke the land was. Clara shook his hand, pulled the collar of her grandfather's old denim jacket tight against the October wind, and started walking the perimeter. She didn't see dead soil. She saw a blank page. Her family had forced her out 3 weeks earlier, on the night of her grandmother's memorial service. The fight had been building for years, ever since Clara started spending more time in her grandmother's greenhouse than at the dinner table. Her father, a practical man who managed the regional lumber yard, had never approved of what he called her grandmother's witchcraft gardening. Her stepmother had been more direct, calling it embarrassing and backward. When the will was read and Clara received nothing but her grandmother's handwritten journals and a box of what the lawyer described as dried plant matter, the explosion had been immediate. Her father accused her of manipulating the old woman. Her stepmother said the journals were worthless and the roots were trash. Her older brother, who had received the truck and the savings account, stood in the corner with his arms crossed and said nothing. Clara packed a duffel bag that night, took the box of roots, and walked out into the rain. She had $200 from babysitting, her grandmother's journals, and a certainty that burned in her chest like a coal. The roots were butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa, though nobody in Millbrook called it that. The locals knew it as pleurisy root, an old remedy that had fallen out of use when pharmacies came to town. Clara's grandmother had spent 40 years collecting heritage strains from abandoned homesteads, roadside ditches, and the edges of disappearing prairies. She had selected for color, for nectar production, for the thick, stubborn roots that could survive drought and flood, and the indifferent cruelty of clay soil. To anyone else, the roots looked like twisted pieces of firewood, brown and lifeless, with no green shoots and no promise. But Clara had helped her grandmother plant them for 3 seasons. She knew that the deeder they looked, the more life they held inside. She knew that the thick, woody crown beneath the soil line was a fortress of stored energy, waiting for the right moment to send up shoots that could punch through concrete. Her grandmother had called them sleeping dragons. The family had called them kindling. Her grandmother had taught her to read the roots like a book, to feel the slight give of healthy tissue, to recognize the faint, earthy smell that meant life was still circulating through the woody veins beneath the bark. Clara spent the first week clearing the acre by hand. She couldn't afford equipment, so she used a shovel she found in the Henderson barn, a rusted thing with a cracked handle that she wrapped in duct tape. The clay fought her for every inch. It was full of rocks the size of fists, tangled with the roots of old weeds that had given up years ago, and so dense that each shovel strike felt like chopping wood. Her hands blistered on the first day, bled on the second, and hardened into rough leather by the end of the week. She worked from dawn until the light failed, stopping only to eat peanut butter sandwiches and drink water from a plastic jug. Earl drove by once in his pickup, saw her knee-deep in the gray dirt, and didn't stop. The neighbors watched from their porches, whispering about the poor Bennett girl who had lost her mind along with her grandmother. Clara didn't look up. She was listening to the land, feeling the way the clay held moisture in some spots and rejected it in others, mapping the subtle rises and depressions that would matter when the rains came. She planted the roots on the last day of October, when the first hard frost was already painting the hollows silver. There were exactly 463 of them, each one cataloged in her grandmother's journal with a date and a location. Some were thick as her wrist, others thin as pencils, but all of them shared the same rough, woody exterior that made them look like something fit for a burn pile. Clara dug holes 18 inches apart, working in rows that stretched the length of the acre, each hole deep enough to bury the crown 2 inches below the surface. She added nothing to the soil. Her grandmother's journals had been specific about that. The roots didn't need rich soil. They needed honest soil, soil that hadn't been lied to with chemical fertilizers and false promises. They needed to fight a little to work for their place, because that struggle was what made them strong enough to survive. Clara placed each root gently, speaking to it the way her grandmother had spoken, covering it with the same gray clay everyone else despised, and moving to the next. By sunset, her back was screaming, her knees were caked in mud, and 463 sleeping dragons lay beneath the surface of the most worthless acre in Mason County. That night, she sat on the porch of the old barn and wrote in her own journal for the first time, recording the weather, the soil temperature, and the exact moment when the last root went into the ground. November came with freezing rain and sleet that turned the clay into a gray soup. Clara had found a room above the laundromat in town, paying for it with the last of her babysitting money, and by helping the owner fold towels on Saturday nights. Every morning before school, she rode her bicycle the 4 miles to the acre, stood at the fence line, and looked out over the empty field. There was nothing to see. The ground was flat gray and dead-looking, marked only by the rows of tiny mounds where she had buried the roots. The wind cut through her jacket, and the sky hung low and colorless, the kind of Kentucky winter sky that seemed to press the life out of everything beneath it. The neighbors had stopped laughing by then. They had moved on to pity, which was worse. Mrs. Gable from the post office brought her a casserole and told her that sometimes we need to let go of the past to move forward. Pastor Williams stopped his car one morning and suggested that grief counseling might help her process her grandmother's death in healthier ways. Even the teenagers at school, who had once found her greenhouse obsession mildly interesting, now looked away when she passed, as if her madness might be contagious. Clara stood in the wind, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she smiled. They thought she was mourning, she was waiting. December buried the acre in snow, a rare white Christmas for Kentucky, that made the field look like a blank canvas stretched beneath the bare branches of the oak trees along the fence line. Clara couldn't afford Christmas, so she spent the day at the acre, brushing snow away from a few of the mounds, checking that the freeze hadn't heaved any of the roots out of the ground. They were silent and still, locked in the deep sleep of dormancy. She read her grandmother's journals by flashlight in her room above the laundromat, learning the history of each root. This one came from the edge of the old Watkins place, before it was sold to developers. That one from a ditch near the interstate, rescued before the bulldozers came. Another from a forgotten cemetery, growing wild among the headstones of pioneers who had once used it to treat coughs and chest pain. Her grandmother had been an archaeologist of the overlooked, a curator of things the modern world had decided were worthless. Clara fell asleep each night with the journals on her chest, dreaming of orange flowers and wings. January brought ice storms that snapped power lines and trapped people in their homes. Clara lost her job at the laundromat when a pipe burst and flooded the basement. She took a position washing dishes at the diner on Route 68, working the evening shift for minimum wage and leftover pie. She was 17, alone, and officially the town's cautionary tale. Parents pointed her out to their children as an example of what happens when you don't listen to reason, when you let imagination override common sense. The diner's regulars talked about her in low voices, speculating about how long it would be before she gave up and came crawling back to her father. Clara listened to all of it while she scrubbed plates, her hands submerged in water, so hot it turned her skin red. She didn't argue, she didn't explain. She just worked, saved every dollar she didn't spend on rent, and rode her bicycle to the acre every morning to stand in the freezing wind and look at gray dirt. The roots were still sleeping, but she knew they were dreaming. One regular, a trucker named Hank who ran the interstate route, left her a $5 tip and a note that said, "Keep fighting, kid," and she taped it to her bathroom mirror where she could see it every morning. February was the hardest month. The money ran out. Clara was 2 weeks behind on rent, and the landlord, a kind woman named Doris who had known her grandmother, told her she could stay until March but no longer. The diner cut her hours when tourist season failed to materialize. She ate one meal a day, usually the scraps from the kitchen, and her jeans hung loose on her hips. She got sick in the middle of the month, a chest cold that settled into her lungs and made every breath a conscious effort. For 3 days, she couldn't make it to the acre. She lay on her mattress on the floor, shivering under a thin blanket, reading her grandmother's journals through fever-blurred eyes and wondering if everyone was right. Maybe the roots were dead. Maybe she was deluding herself, holding on to a fantasy, because the reality of her life was too painful to accept. On the 4th day, she forced herself up, wrapped her grandfather's jacket around her thin frame, and walked the 4 miles in the gray dawn because she had promised the roots she would be there. When she arrived, the field was unchanged, gray, silent, empty. She stood at the fence line, tears freezing on her cheeks, and she whispered an apology for doubting. Then she turned and walked back to town to work her shift. That night, she found a $20 bill in her jacket pocket that she knew she hadn't put there. She bought soup, paid a few dollars toward rent, and slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The fever made her hallucinate, and she dreamed of her grandmother standing in the field, wearing her old blue apron, pointing at the ground with a smile that said everything was going to be fine. When she woke, the dream stayed with her like a warm hand on her shoulder. March arrived with mud and false hope. The snow melted, the clay turned to sticky gray paste, and the first brave weeds poked their heads above the surface of the acre. But none of them were in Clara's rows. The crabgrass came back. The dandelions returned. A patch of thistle appeared near the fence line. aggressive and green and mocking. Clara's rows remained bare, the mounds flattened by winter, looking like nothing more than the scars of a failed project. Earl drove by in his truck and didn't slow down. The neighbors stopped pitying her and started ignoring her, which in a small town was the final stage of dismissal. She had become part of the landscape, like the rusted fence or the leaning barn. Something unfortunate but unremarkable. Clara planted nothing new. She didn't add seeds or try to fill the gaps. She just walked the rows, her boots sinking into the mud, checking the spots where she had buried the roots. The clay was cold and wet and showed no signs of life. She pressed her palm against the ground anyway, feeling for a pulse. She told herself that roots worked on their own timeline, not hers. She told herself that her grandmother had taught her patience, and patience was not the ability to wait, but the ability to keep a good attitude while waiting. She wasn't sure her attitude was good, but she was still waiting. April brought rain, warm showers that washed the winter gray out of the sky and turned the Kentucky hills a tentative green. The oak trees along the fence line budded with tiny leaves, the ditches filled with daffodils that someone had planted decades ago. The world was waking up, stretching, shaking off the cold. Except for Clara's acre, it remained stubbornly, defiantly gray. She walked the rows every morning before her shift at the diner, and every morning she found the same thing: dirt, clay, the occasional worm that had surfaced to escape the wet. No shoots, no green, no sign that 463 roots had any intention of rising. The regulars at the diner had moved on to other gossip, but occasionally someone would ask her about the dead root field, and the question would carry that particular tone of amused contempt that people use when they know they are right and you are wrong. Clara would smile and say they were welcome to come see for themselves in June. They never came. They didn't need to. They knew what dead looked like. If you have ever believed in something that everyone else called impossible, I want you to tell me where you are watching from right now, because this next part is for you. Drop your city or country in the comments, and let me know if you have ever held on to hope when everyone else let go. May was when the doubt returned in earnest. Spring was in full swing across Mason County. Gardens were planted, lawns were mowed, and the farm supply store did brisk business in tomato seedlings and fertilizer. Clara's acre sat like a wound in the middle of the greening landscape, an acre of gray clay surrounded by life. She had started working a second job, cleaning offices in the county courthouse on weekends, and her body was a constant map of aches. Her hands, once soft from greenhouse work, were permanently rough, the nails broken and rimmed with clay that no amount of scrubbing could remove. She was 18 now, her birthday passing in a quiet Tuesday that involved a free slice of pie from the diner and a long walk around the acre in the rain. She stood at the fence line, looking at the empty field, and for the first time since October, she felt the cold finger of genuine despair. She had given everything to this land: her money, her time, her reputation, her family, and the land had given her nothing back but silence. She thought about her brother, driving her grandmother's truck to his job at the bank. She thought about her father and stepmother, living in the house with the new kitchen renovation. She thought about how easy it would be to walk away, to admit defeat, to let the acre return to the weeds and the thistles and the slow erosion of time. She stood there until dark, and then she did what she had done every day for 7 months. She whispered goodnight to the roots, and she walked home. The first shoot appeared on the morning of May 23rd. Clara almost missed it. She was so accustomed to seeing nothing that her eyes had stopped looking for something. She was walking the third row from the east fence, her boots heavy with dew, when a flash of color caught her peripheral vision. She stopped. She bent down. And there, pushing through a crack in the clay no wider than a pencil, was a spear of green no taller than her thumb. It was the color of new life, impossibly bright against the gray soil, and it was curled slightly, as if shy about being the first to arrive. Clara fell to her knees. Her fingers hovered over the shoot, afraid to touch it, afraid it might be a hallucination born of too much hope and too little food. But it was real. It was solid. It was alive. She ran the entire acre after that, scanning every row, every mound, every inch of gray dirt with a desperation that made her dizzy. By the time she reached the last row, she had found 11 more. 11 tiny green soldiers, pushing through clay that agricultural textbooks said was impenetrable, rising from roots that agricultural experts said were dead. Clara sat down in the middle of the field, surrounded by silence and green, and she wept. By early June, the shoots had multiplied. There were 50, then 100, then 200. They weren't uniform. Some were thick and strong, rising 6 inches with leaves already unfurling. Others were thin and tentative, barely breaking the surface, as if testing the air before committing to the sky. But they were there. The acre was no longer gray so completely. It was dotted with green, a scattered constellation of life that grew denser every day. Clara's morning walks became celebrations. She named the first shoot Hope, the second one Grace, the third one after her grandmother. She talked to them while she walked, telling them about her shift at the diner, about the rude customer who had stiffed her on a tip, about the way the sunrise looked from the courthouse steps. The plants didn't answer, but their presence was a conversation. They were listening. They were growing. They were keeping their end of the bargain. The neighbors started noticing. Mrs. Gable drove by one morning and actually stopped her car, staring at the green speckles that had transformed the dead field. She didn't say anything to Clara. She just looked, and then she drove away. But she told people at the post office, and slowly the whispers changed. They weren't laughing anymore. They were watching. But nature is not a fairy tale, and the universe does not hand out miracles without testing the recipient's resolve. June brought heat, the kind of sustained, baking warmth that turns clay into concrete and makes every living thing fight for water. The creek that ran along the back of the property dried up for the first time in a decade. The oak trees dropped their leaves early, conserving moisture. And Clara's shoots, those brave green soldiers that had punched through winter and doubt, began to suffer. The heat was relentless. The clay held what water it had like a miser, and the young roots weren't deep enough yet to reach the reserves below. The leaves curled. The stems drooped. Some of the weaker shoots turned yellow and collapsed, retreating back into the earth they had fought so hard to escape. Clara watered them by hand, carrying buckets from the nearest working spigot a quarter-mile away, walking back and forth until her shoulders felt like they might separate from her spine. She gave each plant a cup of water, no more, because that was all she could carry. It wasn't enough. The heat laughed at her buckets. The sun drank her water before it reached the roots. She stood in the field at noon, watching her plants struggle, and she felt the old despair return. Heavier this time, because she had allowed herself to hope. Julie was a war. Clara fought on 3 fronts. She fought the heat, which baked the clay and threatened to desiccate everything green. She fought the pests, which arrived in clouds of aphids and beetles drawn to the only tender growth in a parched landscape. And she fought the voices, which returned with fresh ammunition, now that her plants were visible and vulnerable. Her father drove by one afternoon, saw her hauling water, and told her she was wasting her life on weeds that would be dead by August. Her stepmother made a comment at the church picnic about how some people never learn their lesson. Even Earl, who had been kind enough in his gruff way, suggested that maybe it was time to plow it under and plant something sensible in the fall, like winter wheat. Clara listened to all of it. She said nothing. She just kept hauling water, picking beetles off leaves by hand, and checking the soil each morning with her fingers. The plants that survived the heat were changing. They were growing thicker stems, tougher leaves, sending roots deeper into the clay with a determination that seemed almost angry. They weren't just surviving. They were adapting. They were becoming exactly what the land needed them to be. Clara didn't know it yet, but they were preparing to stun. She kept account of every beetle she removed, reaching 147 in a single afternoon. And she told herself that each pest removed was a promise kept to the green life fighting beneath her feet. She collected rainwater in old buckets when the occasional storm passed, storing it behind the barn like liquid gold, rationing it out drop by precious drop as the thermometer climbed past 90 degrees day after day. August arrived with a thunderstorm that split the sky open and dropped 3 inches of rain in 6 hours. The parched earth drank it so fast that the creek didn't even fill. But the roots drank too, deep, greedy. After months of struggling in the concrete clay, the water reached places it had never reached before, and something dormant inside the plants woke up. The growth that followed wasn't gradual, it was explosive. In the span of 2 weeks, the acre transformed from a field of struggling green shoots into a jungle of thick, leafy stalks that rose waist-high, then chest-high, then shoulder-high. The leaves were dark green and glossy, shaped like spear points, and they covered the ground so completely that the gray clay disappeared beneath a living carpet. The neighbors who had driven by in June and seen dots of green now saw a wall of vegetation, dense and vigorous and utterly alien to anything that should have grown in that cursed soil. People stopped their cars. They took pictures with their phones. They posted them on social media with captions like, "What is happening at the old Henderson place?" The posts spread. The county agricultural extension agent came out, walked the perimeter, and left scratching his head. He told his colleagues that the growth rate was impossible for butterfly weed, that the density violated every principle of plant spacing, and that the soil, which he had tested himself as part of a county survey 5 years ago and found to be 90% compacted clay with a pH of 4.2, now showed signs of organic matter and improved structure. He couldn't explain it. He wrote it off as a fluke. But he kept coming back to look. September was when the buds appeared. Clara noticed them on the first morning of the month, walking the rows with her coffee in a thermos, her heart still pounding from the August growth. They were small, tight clusters at the top of the tallest stalks, green and unassuming, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. But Clara had spent 3 years with her grandmother. She knew what butterfly weed buds looked like. She knew that each cluster would open into a burst of orange, so intense it seemed to generate its own light. She knew that the nectar inside those buds was rich enough to feed monarch butterflies on their 1,000-mile journey south. She stood in the field, surrounded by walls of green, looking at the promise of color, and she felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't hope anymore. Hope was too small a word for what she felt. It was certainty. It was the knowledge that she had been right, that her grandmother had been right, and that the universe, in its slow and deliberate way, was about to balance the scales. She didn't tell anyone about the buds. She let the town wonder about the green wall. She let the extension agent scratch his head. She waited. The way her grandmother had taught her, with the patience of roots. The first flower opened on September 15th. Clara was there to see it, having arrived before dawn because she couldn't sleep. The bud split slowly, peeling back its green casing to reveal a petal the color of sunset, of molten copper, of a flame frozen in time. It was a single flower on a single stalk, but it was so vivid against the green that it looked like a signal fire. Clara sat down in the dirt, her coffee forgotten, and watched the morning light hit the orange petals. They seemed to glow from within, as if the flower had captured a piece of the sun and was holding it for safekeeping. The scent was faint but unmistakable, honey-sweet with a hint of vanilla, drifting on the cool morning air like a whispered secret. By noon, there were 20 flowers open. By evening, 50. By the end of the week, the acre was no longer green. It was orange, a solid, shimmering, breathtaking expanse of orange that could be seen from the road, from the highway, from the air. It was the color of defiance. It was the color of resurrection. It was the color of everything the town had said was impossible. But the flowers were only the beginning. The stunning part, the part that would make national news and change Clara's life forever, arrived on silent wings. The monarchs came on September 20th, driven by some ancient instinct that drew them to nectar sources along their migration path. They found Clara's acre, and they came in numbers that no one in Kentucky had seen in 20 years. At first it was dozens, fluttering among the orange flowers like living stained glass. Then it was hundreds, the air thick with black and orange wings. Then it was thousands. By the afternoon of September 22nd, the acre was not just a field of flowers. It was a living cloud of butterflies, so dense that from a distance it looked like the ground itself was moving. The monarchs fed on the nectar, rested on the leaves, and filled the air with a soft, rustling sound like prayer. People came from neighboring counties to see it. They parked along the road and stood at the fence line, speechless. The extension agent brought a photographer from the state university. The local news station sent a crew. Social media exploded with images of the girl who had planted dead roots and grown a miracle. Clara stood at the edge of her acre on the morning of September 23rd. 9 months to the day since she had buried the first root in the gray clay. She was no longer the crazy girl with garbage bags. She was the teenager who had turned a worthless acre into a monarch way station, who had grown a field of impossible orange, from roots everyone had called dead, who had done what agricultural science said couldn't be done. Her father came on the second day of the bloom. He stood at the fence line in his work clothes, his truck idling behind him, and he looked at the field without speaking. Clara didn't go to him. She let him look. She let him see what his mother's roots had become, what his daughter's faith had created. He left without saying a word, but she saw him wipe his eyes before he got in the truck. Her stepmother didn't come. Her brother sent a text message that said, "I'm sorry." It was 3 words, and Clara read them 100 times before she finally put her phone away. The town of Millbrook, which had spent 9 months whispering about her failure, now found itself whispering about her success, and the silence of those who had mocked her was louder than any apology could have been. She never forgot the way the butterflies felt against her skin. The scientific explanation came later, when the university researchers analyzed the soil and the plants. They discovered that Clara's grandmother had spent 40 years selecting not just for color and nectar, but for a specific mycorrhizal relationship. The roots carried a strain of fungus that broke down compacted clay, that pulled nutrients from rock, that created a network beneath the soil, so complex it functioned like a single organism. The dead roots had been sleeping repositories of biological technology, carrying a solution to dead soil that no chemical fertilizer could match. The plants hadn't just grown. They had healed the land. The soil tests in October, after the flowers had faded and the monarchs had continued south, showed organic matter up 400%, pH balanced to 6.5, and earthworm populations that rivaled prime farmland. The acre that had been worthless was now worth more than the house Clara had been forced to leave. The roots that had been trash were now the foundation of a business that would sell heritage butterfly weed plants to restoration projects across the country. Earl, the retired mechanic who had given her the acre for the price of clearing a fence, deeded her the entire 5-acre property in December. He said he had never seen anything in his 70 years that made him believe in miracles, and he was too old to start now, but he figured she should have the land anyway. Mrs. Gable from the post office came to her in January with a proposal to partner on a pollinator seed company. The diner where Clara had washed dishes named a milkshake after her, the Monarch Special, orange and sweet. The agricultural extension agent wrote a paper about her soil, and she was invited to speak at conferences, where people with PhDs asked her questions. She answered with her grandmother's journals and the wisdom of observation. She was 18 years old, and she had proven that dead was not the end. It was only the beginning, if you knew how to wait. Her family asked her to come home in February, after the news stories and the speaking invitations made it clear that she was not, in fact, a cautionary tale. Her father offered her room back. Her stepmother offered an apology that Clara accepted but did not believe, and her brother offered to help her build a greenhouse on the property. Clara thanked them. She told them she loved them. And she told them she was staying in the small apartment above the laundromat, which Doris had let her keep because it was close to her acre and because she had learned that home wasn't a building. Home was a place you built with your own hands, with patience, with faith in things you couldn't yet see. She visited them on Sundays for dinner. She brought them bouquets of dried butterfly weed in the winter. But she didn't go back to live with them. Some roots, once planted, can't be transplanted. They need to stay where they fought to grow. The acre is still there, behind the old Henderson barn, though the barn has been painted and the fence is new. In September, it still turns orange, still draws monarchs by the thousands, still makes people pull over on the highway and stand with their hands over their mouths. Clara is older now, her hands permanently rough, her hair streaked with early gray from too many winters in the wind. She has a team that helps her run the heritage root business, and she has a small house on the edge of the property where she reads her grandmother's journals to her own daughter. She still walks the rows every morning, still speaks to the plants, still listens for the voice of the land beneath the noise of the world. People ask her sometimes for the secret. They want to know what fertilizer she used, what technique she employed, what shortcut she discovered. She tells them the truth, though they rarely believe it. She tells them that the secret was never in the soil, or the roots, or the science. The secret was in the waiting. The secret was in showing up every day for 9 months, carrying water when there was no rain, believing in green when all you could see was gray, trusting that what looked dead was only preparing to live. She tells them that you cannot rush a root. You cannot force a flower. You can only create the conditions, remove the obstacles, and have the courage to let time do what time does best. The land, she says, doesn't need our cleverness. It needs our patience. And if we give it that, if we truly give it that, it will stun us every single time. Sometimes the most beautiful things in life are the ones that make us wait the longest. And the roots that look the most dead are the ones that hold the most life. She tells them that every person has an acre inside them, a place that looks dead but is only waiting for the right roots, the right rain, and the right amount of time to transform into something that stuns the world. Trust it.